For those joining us, we'll wait 2 more minutes to let some people in, and then we can get started. So we might get going as we let a few more people in. This time I'm not introducing someone else, just myself. For those of you who haven't met me, my name's Job, and I'm at Charles Sturt University, which is somewhere between Sydney and Brisbane in Port Macquarie on the east coast of Australia. If you're joining us from somewhere outside of Australia or you're watching this after the fact. So when I put this series together, I initially thought, we're not going to have anyone who actually wants to talk. Now, that's when I put myself in there and said, look, I'll just fill up and I'll be a bit of a buffer. So we've got plenty of people who want to talk. Now, the great thing is that we actually had heaps of interest of people who wanted to share their perspectives on meta-science or meta-science related topics, which is absolutely great. And we've got 2 more talks after this, one early career perspective and then one on why ethical research also has to be rigorous research. Coincidentally, both from early career academics, but the second one that Mariani will do will be more focused on the early career perspective. So without further ado, I'll take the reins here. Feel free to interrupt me or ask questions if you need to. Otherwise, we'll always leave some room at the end. So this is a talk that I've done a few times, and I've adopted it slightly for the population here. But basically, I want to talk to you about what the open science movement is and why you should care about it, and why it's our responsibility to either push it forwards, evaluate it in the way that it should be evaluated, etc. So what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we'll just briefly chat about why research is at a crossroads. And I think I don't do that justice. We've had much more important and knowledgeable speakers here who've been able to provide us with that perspective, but I'll just reiterate some of the points for those people who haven't joined us before. And then I'll talk a bit about what is the open science movement and why is it there? Why do we even need open science? Is it something that's valuable to us? Also, what can we do about it and how can we participate? And then most importantly, we'll address some questions of what open science is not, or which issues it cannot address, or some of its unintended negative consequences, because I think that's important as well, especially given the group here. And finally, we'll have some time for discussions and questions. You'll note that all of the links and research, etc., that I've used was emailed to you, so you can always click that link, use all the links there, which might be easier than kind of writing them down here. And I always start with this first slide, which I think is a great ironic depiction of what open science, or why open science is necessary. We've got this article in Nature on the growing inaccessibility of science, for which you now have to pay $9 to read it, right? Doesn't make much sense, but it sets a good tone for the rest of our conversation. So we've talked about this before, right? We've talked about the reproducibility crisis and that research is at a crossroads and that perhaps much research is too good to be true. And I agree with that. It's also the case in my field that many of the research findings are just almost unbelievable or incredible. And before, Franco's done a great job at introducing some of these reproducibility issues, for example, in psychological science, but also in the medical sciences. So I don't have to do that again, but remember that part of the reason why we need more transparent and open science is also because we've suffered with some incredibility issues. So I keep referring to this one blog article. And for those people who've interacted with me in other ways, I would have definitely sent you this blog article before. But basically, it's Samin's perspective on, do we want to be credible? And she says, comma, or incredible, which I think is a really great play of words that demonstrates, what do we want? Do we want sensational findings in obscurity, hopefully with as little transparency as possible, so when people don't believe these findings, they also can't check whether they are true? Or do we want credible science, a scientific endeavor that people can truly trust? I sometimes start off this presentation by saying that trust in science has declined, but that's not the case at all levels, right? At some levels, trust in science has increased, but there's plenty of pockets. Think of, for example, misinformation around vaccination, global warming, etc., where there's a serious distrust in science. And now we can say, well, that distrust is there, there's nothing we can do about it, or we can say, well, let's take ownership and let's try and see if we can make science more credible. So one of the key issues that the open science movement deals with is the fact that access to scientific research is sold. So when you look at these articles, and again, I've linked them for you in the file that comes with this this presentation, is that a lot of taxpayer money goes to funding research, right? I hope everyone's aware, whether that's in their own country or in Australia, that the taxpayer funds a lot of our research endeavors. In fact, even your university would argue, if you would talk to university administrators, they would tell you the same, that when you do research, that oftentimes that's at a status quo or at a loss for the university. It's the teaching component that makes the money, and oftentimes the research component that costs money. So in other words, research costs a lot of money from all kinds of different stakeholders, whether it's university students paying enrollment fees, and part of which is used to fund research endeavors for academics, whether it's through taxes, through government-funded subsidies, and so on. So if the end user is already paying for research, why do we make research so inaccessible to them? They've already paid for it, often not once, but twice, maybe thrice. And still, if someone from outside of an academic institution, and this happens a lot to me, given I do lots of education that uses scientific literature, lots of people who can't access it will then email me and say, look, actually, you talked about these papers. I thought it was really great. I try to access them, but I now have to pay $49.95 just to read it for 3 days. Right? It doesn't make any sense that the end user is paying for that research multiple times. And it's not just that, it's also the fact that the publishers make enormous amounts of money off the backs of the scientific community. So it's not just that the community itself pays for research multiple times, it's also that the publishers who then hold some of the IP of that research make their money off the backs of the academics who, for example, review for free, provide their IP to a journal, and the journal holds that IP in perpetuity, etc. So if you look at the top 5, which is Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, Springer Nature, and Sage, they generate about 19 billion pounds. This is in British pounds annually. So Elsevier, which is the biggest one of those, generates about 1.79 billion pounds of profit margin. Right? It's not just generated or money they generate, but the profit margin is 40%. Well, profit margin for Google in Q2 of 2025 was 31%. So these publishers rival, if not trump, some of the largest companies and the companies to which we attribute really large profit margins. And I'm not saying people can't make money or companies can't make money, but if you make money by restricting access to what is really a public good, then I'm not so sure if I'm in favor. But we can talk about what people think about that later down the track. But this is just to paint the picture. It's big business. And on top of that, Elsevier also spends about 466 million last year, or spent, or is spending pounds on upgrading their IT systems. So it's not as if, for example, a publisher like PLOS, any profit they generate is put back into the community. No, these for-profit publishers are using their profit to then upgrade their own systems or to keep it in a private sense. And as a result, they are absolute money-making machines. They print money. There's free review labor, free writing labor. You write for free. They can sell your IP in perpetuity. And just to give a perspective here, one of our accreditation bodies asked me the other day if I wanted to write some courses for their internal professional development program. And at that point, they also gave me a contract that said that my IP would be sold in perpetuity. The moment you see that, usually you back away. So they can sell your IP. Once you write the paper, that paper really no longer belongs to you, even though you use it as a line on your CV, but it belongs to them, all IP within it, etc. Additionally, for those of you who publish hybrid or gold open access, you would have also seen that there's article processing charges. For example, to publish in Nature, it costs you about 19,000 Aussie dollars on average. So open access fees are also a significant way for a publisher to generate money. Now, we have to remember that there's also a cost, right? If a publisher hosts an article, and especially when they used to print it, then ship out that printing to everyone, etc. But now when they host it online, they keep the metadata. They also have to keep that metadata in perpetuity, etc. They claim that it costs them about 2,500 US dollars per paper. So that allows you to kind of measure that profit margin. Imagine that, let's say lecturers in Australia have an hourly wage of about $70. Think about how long it takes you to do research and to write a single paper, and then kind of do a plus minus versus that 2,500. I think the cost that you contribute, or the free labor that they get from you, easily offsets the $2,500 per paper. In Australia, we spend about $300 million on journal prescriptions alone. That is in journals or libraries buying access to journals, but also lots of you would have open access publication agreements with your university, where in certain journals, for example, you get 50 publications in journal X and 60 publications in journal Y that are open access. They are also counted. But 300 million is a big chunk. But we're actually at about 1 billion when we also cost or count article processing charges. And I'll tell you why that's become such a significant number. Because when you look at some of the mandated requirements for some of the largest funding bodies, let's say in Australia, but also worldwide, lots of these funding bodies now require you to publish open access. And that's great, but they're not saying diamond open access. So they're probably not recommending you to publish in, for example, scholar-led journals. They're talking about gold or hybrid open access with article publication fees. Now, the taxpayer's money funds about 800 million in grants from the ARC, 900 million from the NHMRC, and the National Research Infrastructure Scheme about 330 million. On top of that, the taxpayer now pays about 1 billion in APCs, a proportion of that 1 billion, but we can kind of see, if that compounds, how difficult it is for a normal human being to actually access research, and how expensive accessing that research is, because we haven't even counted the time it takes to do the actual research, the portion of our salaries that's paid by the taxpayer, etc. So at that point, when we started, or when people started realizing, hey, why does the community have to pay so much to access something that they've already paid multiple times for, that's when kind of the open science movement came about. So we definitely need to do better. At first, we need more efforts at reproducibility. Franco's discussed that at length before, but we need much more transparency, and we also need equitable access. I'll talk to you later a little bit, but you can imagine that some universities in the world can't fork out several billions in open access publication schemes each year. And as a result, some people who happen to work in some countries and happen to live there can't publish their work open access, and people who live in those countries can't access their own taxpayer-funded research at all. So in order to get better public engagement and better trust, because we keep talking about why is the public not engaged with our research? I'm sure that every single one of your institutions at some point or another has asked you to do more co-design or do more industry-based work. Well, we can't be surprised they're not all that interested if they see how much they're paying for it and how difficult it is still to access that research. So in order to increase engagement and to increase trust, we need to do something different. So the open science movement was really developed as a reform movement that wanted to focus on rectifying some of those issues that were really prevalent. For example, the lack of transparency and the lack of access. And as a result, it promotes transparency and accessibility and inclusivity. And that is to improve scientific process and to strengthen our trust in research findings. And I think if you're all a little bit introspective, I think most of the people who are here are from fairly, wealthy countries or institutions. And I don't want to make a blanket statement because I can't see everyone. But we often take it for granted how easy it is for us to access that research because our institutions pay a lot for it. Imagine that you're in a different institution somewhere where that access is more limited. Do they not have a right to the same access to research than we do? Do they not have access to the best possible evidence in order to inform their practices and so on? So on the open science framework, which is, if you're really interested in this open science movement, I recommend you take a look at this life cycle open sciences, because the open science framework is a really good resource, and it has resources you can see in every parts of these aspects of the life cycle of open science. But for this portion, we're going to specifically talk about pre-registration and then more the practical sense, because Alex has talked us through philosophically and theoretically and conceptually what pre-registration is and should be. We'll talk about how do you make your work open access, how do we open peer review, and how can you contribute and help there, and what are preprints and how can you use them to your own benefit. So like I said before, this is kind of the outline of what we'll do. Talk about some pre-registration stuff, preprinting, also sometimes called green open access. Then we'll talk about different other types of open access, which you might not know. There's different types of open access publication. We'll talk about something really cool, which is post-publication peer review, which I'm hoping some of you will get involved in. We'll talk about other opens. What else can be open? Can you have open software? Can you have open other things? And then we'll talk, very importantly, about the downsides, and I'll spend a minute to plug our Big Ideas series at the end of the talk. So for most of you who've done a pre-registration before, you'll be familiar with the Open Science Framework pre-registration portal. So what you can do is you go to osf.io, you click on this here, and it gives you a drop-down link. You go to registrations, and you can develop a pre-registration. Now, what is great is that people who work at the Open Science Framework have done a lot of work on developing templates that you can use so that your pre-registrations are developed well. So really, there's no more excuse not to pre-register, right? You know about it now. You can go to the website, use any template. Additionally, there's no real downside to pre-registering either. Even if you pre-register something that's fairly exploratory, sometimes it might be interesting for you to pre-register, so you need to think through your methods. So you need to make it transparent of what your thought process was. and it definitely doesn't harm to do it. Now, you don't have to go to the Open Science Framework. You can also go to aspredicted.org, or if you've got a clinical trial, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. In any of these places, you can pre-register work. Oftentimes, some servers are more suitable to certain types of pre-registrations. You can see here, this is, for example, me. I've got some public projects. Some of those have pre-registrations. Some of those have preprints, etc. And I'll just show you kind of what that looks like. So this is the project outline. There's all kinds of pre-registrations in there. Some are in advanced stages of development. Some are now published manuscripts. Some are not, etc. But you can see here that on the Open Science Framework, it allows you to choose the type of pre-registration that you want. Now, for those of you, I realize, who've done pre-registrations before, this is a bit of an introduction, or a bit of a layman's introduction. But what I'm hoping is that those people who've done it before recognize it and it's front of mind. And those people who haven't, it's not really a big deal to do a pre-registration. It's fairly simple. People have done so much work to make it really easy for you. And then you can see here, these are some of the pre-registrations I have in here. You can see that this project can have a pre-registration. It can have some data attached to it, analytic code, materials and papers and supplements and so on. So it allows you to make every step of your research project as open to the community as you want. You can also embargo your pre-registration. You can say, well, actually, I don't want anyone to know that I'm doing this research just yet, because I'm working on the next rocket that's going to challenge Elon Musk's space program. I don't want anyone to know about it. You can embargo it as well. Of course, embargoing requires a good reason, but sometimes, or in different fields, certain types of embargoing can be really useful. You can also ensure that your registration is anonymous for peer review purposes. So it doesn't mean that automatically a peer review becomes single blind, as in you're not blinded to the reviewer, but the reviewer is blinded to you. You can also make it so that this project, during the time that it's in review, can be viewed, but the authors contributing to it cannot. Of course, that makes it extra important that you also properly declare conflicts of interest outside of that. You can see that the Open Science Framework does a lot more than that, right? It allows you to look up actually who's doing work in my area, who has some pre-registrations already. I just quickly typed in skill acquisition, which is my area. And then you can see here, I was just thinking tomorrow about starting a project on perceived skill acquisition and bowling pins. There's no point doing that. Or perhaps I might email Michael here and say, hey, what are you working on? I was thinking of doing the same. Could we potentially collaborate? You can also go and look up what are separate institutions doing. You know, what's Arizona State University doing? Which kind of preprints have they logged recently? What does that preprint look like? Is that method fairly similar to mine? Is it worth emailing this person or not? And so on. So it allows you to do a whole lot of things, including if you ever organize a conference. It allows you to make all of the conference abstracts open access, for example, to people. So I have to say the OSF is an amazing resource, and people who do work on it do a fantastic job to make it as easy for us as possible, to make science as transparent as possible. Now, once you've done a pre-registration and you're working on your research, you've collected your data, you've analyzed everything, you've got a draft of your manuscript there, you might send your draft to some peers, to a red team, they'll criticize you, etc. But then maybe you want to make your research openly available before peer review to the scientific community. And you can do that in all kinds of preprint servers. In general, there's, for example, archives, so RXIV. There's a general archive, there's an archive for psychology, but we've got one for sport and exercise, which Stork, the Society for Transparency, Openness and Replication in Kinesiology, has kindly made available to us. And there's great work on this Stork preprint server that you can go and read. And what that allows you to do is twofold. it allows you to ask feedback from the scientific community or other community. Perhaps you've written something on a particular protein and you want to ask some pharmacologist. It allows you to share that version of that paper with them really easily, request feedback, and make modifications. You can upload multiple versions of a preprint as well. It's not because a preprint is uploaded that therefore it's in the ether forever and you can't change it. You can upload a subsequent version, which you call, for example, after community review. So it can be really useful to get opinions, perspectives from the scientific community before you send your paper out for peer review. It also allows you, and we can see that here, for example, it also allows you to do something really cool, which is when you upload it, you can see here, you can see the amount of times that a paper has been downloaded. Now, sometimes it is difficult to get through the barrier of editorial review of a journal. But preprinting something and then saying, well, actually, on this preprint server, lots of people have downloaded it, and looked at it. It seems to be a really, or a topic of real interest to the scientific community, can be really useful to get through that barrier. So I'm just saying that because, yes, we're serving the community, but you can also have a self-serving interest here too. Then once you've done your preprint, your preprint or your green open access publication, you've received information from the scientific community, you might want to publish it. And I'm saying you might want to, because there are people who only publish green open access. They don't care about the peer review that is offered by journals. And in a way, we can all understand them, because everyone here has had an experience with a reviewer that was far from supportive in the context of developing better science, right? So we can sometimes understand why people wouldn't want to use that service. But if you do, and you want your work to be peer reviewed, you don't necessarily have to give away your rights. You can do something called Diamond Open Access Publication. And Diamond Open Access Publication is a community-driven initiative that's academic-led. Sometimes it's just scholar-led, sometimes it's community and scholar-led, etc. And it basically allows you to publish without paying publication fees. Yeah, so it's basically free to you, and it's free to anyone who wants to read your paper. If you want to have a look at which Diamond Open Access journals exist in our field, we're thinking of things like Communications and Kinesiology, Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior, International Journal of Strength and Conditioning, I think is one, etc. But you can look all of that up here. And for example, if you click, I'll show that in a second, but if you have a look at the Open Journals collective, you can see that this is a collective that brings together information for academics, for librarians, for publishers, that allows you to see what are open access journals like, what are they standing for, right, etc. And when you look at the most popular research, which is the DOAJ, you can see, for example, for one of our journals, which is Communications and Kinesiology, which is also run by Stork, you can see everything about this journal in the blink of an eye. So you can see there are no publication fees. That means you don't pay. And it also means that, in this sense, Diamond Open Access also means that the person who wants to access this work doesn't pay. You can see a lot about the Creative Commons license, which we'll talk about in a second, and any other metadata that comes with the journal. So it's a great resource for you if you want to go and have a look at which Diamond Open Access journals exist in my field, or perhaps at the periphery of that field. But don't be fooled. There's a lot of open access models that are used by predatory publishers. So for those of you who are familiar with Beall's List is the most commonly used resource to figure out what is a predatory publisher. And a predatory publisher is, and this is the formal definition, a publication that charges a fee to publish research papers, but that doesn't offer the standard publishing services such as peer review, or that makes misleading claims about their journals, such as where they're indexed and so on. These are all the emails you're getting in your inbox, calling me Mrs. Fransen. I've read your work with great delight, etc. You can dig into this a lot more, and this doesn't have to be the purpose of today's talk, but be aware that the open access model, especially the gold open access model, where you pay to get your work published, often published quickly, for example, in the case of MDPI, is often used by predatory publishers to get you to fall for that model. There's other open access models. Gold, as I said before, the final published version of the manuscript is immediately available to the public. It remains permanently available, for example, +1, but you pay an APC. There's hybrid versions, so the traditional journals you're submitting to that have both a paywalled as well as an open access version. Oftentimes there's like a few open access publications or articles in every journal issue. And then finally, we've got the bronze ones. This is when, for example, you just published a paper in a journal and the journal says, oh, you get 50 copies for free, share this link. People go to it, and after 50 or whatever, we have no more indication of the terms of use or reuse of the content. And something that you'll often see in these open access publications is the Creative Commons license. The Creative Commons license is important because it tells you about how people or yourself can use and reuse your articles. To give you a perspective, if you publish in a traditional journal, the journal owns the IP, you cannot reprint a figure that you just drew the moment that it's published. You have to ask for permission to reprint that figure. You can see here that most open access publications use the CC BY4, which is the Creative Commons license that allows you to use it for commercial purposes, allows you to remix things in the publication, and allows you to share openly. And it goes from least open, where the publisher reserves all rights. For example, if you publish a book, it'll have this all rights reserved traditionally, where you can't reprint anything. You also can't use similar characters, etc., than were in the book. The great thing, again, of this Creative Commons licensing is it's used almost everywhere, but it's developed as a not-for-profit business that was purely established to get some more transparency, to get some more openness, and the possibility to reproduce scientific content. Now, once your paper is published, or if your paper is not published, well, no, once your paper is published, regardless of how you published it, you might also want some peer review. Now, the peer review that we get with traditional journals can be, to say the least, somewhat disappointing. It can be really good, right? Or it can be really bad, it can be anything in between. It's basically a kind of free-for-all. You never know. But there's another way in which you can go about providing peer review. Let's say you've read an article and you say, well, actually, I'm surprised the reviewers didn't pick up on this very clear error that the authors made. You can go to PubPeer. You can register for PubPeer either in name or anonymously, and you can peer review any work that is out there. Now, of course, we know people can get really opinionated, etc. That doesn't mean every peer review on PubPeer is valid, but it does offer an opportunity for people to still produce some sort of peer review after something has already been peer reviewed by a journal. And that's especially the case when we perhaps think that the peer review has missed something drastic. So, for example, this is kind of what it looks like in our area. There's a paper that was published, and this anonymous person provided a peer review. Regardless of whether that is valuable or not, the authors can then provide correspondence on that peer review, etc. And what that allows us to do is to take the peer review out of the confines of where it's completely hidden in journals. And lots of journals have adopted this method as well, where now peer review gets published alongside a scientific manuscript, for example, or it is openly disclosed who the peer reviewers were after publication, or who the editor was, so that perhaps that peer review process can be picked up again, because we know, or peer review is supposed to be the barrier between poor science and being published. Here, for example, Nature now requires a transparent peer review, or peer review to be published alongside research papers, which you can go and look up, and sometimes these things are really interesting to read. There's other types of open. You can also have open data. You can publish your data openly, or you can use data that's openly available for your own research. You can also put your educational resources, which I think is great, online, because if I teach, let's say, motor learning and control, I bet you that there's 50 other people who teach with exactly the same content as I do. Why not share these resources? There's open hardware, this is typical one is 3D printing, diagrams, etc. And then there's the open software you use every day, like, for example, R. Of course, open access publishing and the open science movement has some unintended negative consequences. And you can read this paper in full, but I'll take out a few for us to think about. But there's an unfair economic burden. The countries that can pay for page publication fees are obviously not the same, right? So we can see that, for example, early career researchers and self-funders, or nations that have a lot of those, have less access to open access publications. Lower and middle income countries and researchers from research poor institutions, which may be institutions who have a heavy teaching load, but a very small research load, also have inequitable access to these page publication fees. There was a time when these open access publication agreements came in place in Australia, where you could see a massive proliferation of open access publications in gold open access journals or hybrid open access journals. And while that's great, because I can now read that research, it does create a bigger divide between those who can pay for it and those who can't, which goes back to the equitable access portion that we talked about before. And like I said, open access carries a burden that this is also what predatory journals often use in order to entice you to publish with them, which means you have to keep your eyes open, or ask your librarian, or look at Beale's list or other lists that clearly indicate journals that are predatory publishers. And one that might be really important for the people who are early career academics here. I know you can't read this, but I just wanted to show you the red. You know, we at my institution, whether we want it or not, we use some sort of method that gives you points based on where you publish. And then you can see here all the ones that you don't get points for are usually the ones that are published open access. So if you want it for career performance advancement, depending on which institution you're at, it might not actually be useful to publish open access because your institution might not recognize it. Of course, you might do it for other reasons, which is great, but you have to take into account that your career can take a hit when you do. For example, here, if you publish with Stork, which is the society I told you about before, they are happy to provide you these sorts of impact statements. So if you go for a promotion, or you have a performance review upcoming, or whatever it might be, they'll tell you how often your work gets read, gets accessed, etc., and they'll provide you with that statement, which in my opinion is much more useful compared to where, in which quartile a journal gets published based on whether a journal is ranked in some sort of index or not. So finally, to conclude, I just wanted to kind of plug what we're doing next. So we've got 2 more sessions, as I said, this year, but then next year we're doing a big ideas series. Daniel Larkins will speak one of those, which is great and very nice of him to offer, but we're still looking for other people who want to share their big ideas. Now, what are we interested in? We're interested in ideas that are so big that perhaps you haven't thought about their implementation. We want to discuss, as a scientific community, big ideas. You don't have to think about whether they are realistic. We just want to hear your ideas, because we know that sometimes these really big ideas spark great communication, collaboration, and so on. And that's really what we want to do. We want to foster that teamwork and that collaborative work in the context of scientific endeavor. If you have questions about that, you can always direct them to Kyle or I. But it would be great if you wanted to attend and speak, that you could use that QR code. Thanks, Sophia. Sophia has nothing but big ideas, which is great. Sign up, use the QR code, or use the link in the email that I sent out. I'll also send another reminder for you. This is just a note. Your big idea, it doesn't matter if you've been in science 5 minutes or 30 years. We care about all of your ideas, and we want to see you present them. We want to have a discussion about them. Every idea is good as long as you bring it. The only bad ideas are the ones that you think about for the rest of your life and you never bring them to the surface. So in summary, we looked at, well, science at a crossroads, and now we can choose, or do we kind of want to be perpetuating the problem, or do we want to be part of the solution, taking into account that this solution is not perfect. So it's not a panacea, but it's a great way to get started. Any resource you need, anything that I've discussed now that you want to discuss further, send me an email, use the links in the document that I sent alongside this. And I'm always open to talk about this, or ways in which you might, want to contribute your time, etc., in some of these initiatives, which are great and really require some smart minds like yourself to contribute. So open for discussion.